topics are life stages and conscience and authority. It is our life states or stages which internalize our values. Understanding these stages helps us to understand why we tend to act a certain way or respond to dilemmas in a certain way. Lawrence Kohlberg's Stages of Moral Development is an adaptation of psychological theory originally conceived by the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Kohlberg's work began on this topic while a psychology graduate student at the University of Chicago back in 1958, and expanded and developed this theory through his life. The theory holds that moral reasoning, the basis for ethical behavior, has 6 identifiable developmental stages, and each is more adequate at responding to moral dilemmas than its predecessor. Kohlberg followed the development of moral judgment far beyond the ages studied earlier by Piaget, who also claimed that logic and morality develop through constructive stages. Expanding on Piaget's work, Kohlberg determined that the process of moral development was mainly concerned with justice, and that it continued throughout the person's lifetime, a notion that spawned dialogue on the philosophical implications of the research. An entire new field within psychology was created as a direct result of Kohlberg's theory, and he is the 16th most frequently cited psychologist in introductory psychology textbooks throughout the century. Kohlberg's scale is about how people justify behaviors and not the ranking of how moral someone's behavior is, and I really want to caution you about that. There is a correlation between how someone scores on the scale and how they behave, and the general hypothesis is that moral behavior is more responsible, consistent, and predictable from people at higher levels. So take that for what it's worth. The higher you are on the scale, the better you are. Well, let's look at these stages. Stage 1 is called the punishment or obedience stage, and choices are made in order to avoid punishment. I don't understand why, but I know if I go in the water, I will get swift punishment. So in order to avoid the pain, I don't go in the water. Stage 2 is called the instrumental relativist, and choices are made at this stage which reap a desired reward. There is some sense of fairness based on you do for me and I'll do for you. And I have learned that if I don't come home wet, you will reward me with tenderness, snuggling, and soft singing. To get the pleasure of the snuggling and soft singing, I will not play in the water. Stage 3 is good boy, nice girl. Choices are made which reflect what others approve of. There is a great deal of conformity to what the majority does. And you might hear this person saying, I don't want to go into the water, but I have learned that if I take the dare and go swimming, you will accept me into your little group. So I go swimming. Stage 4 is law and order, and choices are based on authority, fixed rules, and the maintenance of social order. And there is a sense that one must do his or her duty. This person would say, the rules say don't go in the water after 6 p.m. It doesn't matter that my best hat just flew into the water. It is after 6 p.m., so I will not go in the water and retrieve my hat. Stage 5 is legalistic, or like a social contract. Rights tend to be defined in terms of general individual rights and in terms of standards that have been critically examined by the individual and agreed upon by the whole society. The rules say don't go in the water after 6 p.m., but my best hat just flew in the water, and I have a right to take possession of my personal property in such a situation, regardless of what your rules say. Stage 6, universal ethical principle. Right is defined by a decision of conscience in accord with self-chosen ethical principles, appealing to logical comprehensiveness, universality, and consistency. At heart are the universal principles of justice, reciprocity, and equality of human rights, and respect of the dignity of individual human beings. The rules say don't go into the water after 6 p.m., and everyone must decide for him or herself. However, if they decide they will abide by the rules, that's fine. There are certain situations where it would be an injustice to deny anyone an opportunity to get into the water. So which stage best fits your current life values? Stage 1, punishment and obedience. Stage 2, instrumental relativist. Stage 3, good boy, nice girl. Stage 4, law and order. Stage 5, social contract or legalistic. Or Stage 6, universal ethical principle. So let me give you some additional stage facts. First of all, it's possible for a person to be stuck in a particular stage and not develop any further. That's why you see a 45-year-old functioning at stage 3, trying to make everybody in their life happy. Second, research says that only 5% of the population reaches stage 6, and they're probably around 30 years old. And then thirdly, we define morality and determine what is ethical depending on what we think of ourselves. So this leads us to ethical behavior and you. If an interpreter has a diminished sense of self-esteem, he or she may never have determined what is of value and would act on the expectations of others. If an interpreter comes from a dysfunctional background, then they will act according to the values of others. They would interpret the code as black and white and followed to the letter. And is this really the goal of the CPC? So spend time looking at yourself. What do you value? What do you believe in enough to fight for? Now let me ask you, enough to be fired for? Or enough to engage in an intellectual discussion, but nothing more? In the book, So You Want to Be an Interpreter, it presents some general characteristics of interpreters that must be confronted when dealing with ethical dilemmas. And some of those are low self-esteem, don't like yourself, ashamed of yourself, cover up or compensate for your poor self-concept by being a perfectionist or a caretaker, controlling, judgmental toward others, super responsible or super irresponsible, constantly needing the approval of others, people pleasers or chameleons, changing what you believe to go along with the group, trying to solve other people's problems, being a caretaker, unable to act. Since the Nazi atrocities toward the Jews, the gays, and others, gypsies, were discovered in the end of World War II, people have wondered how so many could have engaged in such obviously unconscionable behaviors. The death camps in which the Jews and others were systematically tortured and killed were efficiently organized and managed by well-trained administrative personnel. And these administrators were not extraordinarily vicious savages running amok. On the contrary, the Germans who ran the death camps seemed to be ordinary, decent citizens with consciences, no different from those of any of us. How could they have blinded themselves to the clear injustice of what they were doing? More generally, what motivates the unethical acts of ordinary, decent people? Perhaps probably one of the most fascinating experiments ever conducted to investigate this very moral question is known as the Milgram experiment, after Stanley Milgram, the psychologist who devised the experiment. The subjects in his experiment were told that they were going to take part in exercises designed to test other people's abilities to learn. They were seated at a mock shock generator, if you will, with 30 switches marked from 15 volts, which was a slight shock, up to 450 volts was danger, severe shock. Through a small glass window, they could see the learner in the adjoining room strapped to a chair with electrodes on his or her wrist. And the subject was told he or she was to test the other person's ability to memorize a list of words and to administer a shock when the learner made a mistake, increasing the intensity each time they made that mistake. As the intensity of the shocks grew, and the learner pretended to cry out in more and more pain, eventually fainting, the experimenter told the subjects they had to continue administering the shocks. Astonishingly, although the subjects grew very nervous and agitated, more than 2/3 administered the highest level of shocks to the learners when ordered to do so by the experimenter. So Milgram concluded that when people are ordered to do something by someone they view in authority, most of them will obey, even when doing so violates their own consciousness. In view of the Milgram experiments, the Nazi crimes are not too difficult to understand. Milgram himself suggested that one of the major factors accounting for the Holocaust was the ready propensity of human beings to obey authorities even when obedience is wrong. Indeed, although Milgram's experiments has been repeated dozens of times with many different groups of people, the results are always the same. Most people will obey external authority over the dictates of conscience. Although Milgram's findings are disturbing, and more recent research has suggested that obedience to authority over conscience is not inevitable. The research of Stephen Sherman, also a psychologist, suggests that education can strengthen the power of conscience over authority. Sherman had a colleague contact several people by telephone, ostensibly to poll them in their opinions. And the pollster asked them what they would do if they were ever ordered to perform a certain act that was morally or socially undesirable, and spent some time discussing the issues with them. So several weeks after the contact was made, these same people were actually asked to carry out that act, and surprisingly, 2/3 refused to obey the order. Which was in sharp contrast to Milgram's findings that 2/3 of those ordered to act against their conscience would normally obey. So the implication of the Sherman experience is that if people will reflect on a moral issue before they are involved in it, they are more likely to behave in accordance with their conscience, and when that issue that they face actually comes up in real life. And this is the reason why it is so important that we discuss these moral dilemmas, these ethical scenarios, these ethical dilemmas with each other, so that we will help get some clarity about how to respond, and when we are faced with that, then we act appropriately. Moral reflection and discussion of the kind found in the best types of moral education subsequently enhance the ethical quality of a person's future choices. I hope you have a great week.